The blood-red sun dipped below the distant mesas as Willow Ravenwood collapsed against the base of a weathered juniper tree, her trembling fingers pressing against the gash in her thigh that painted her skirts crimson. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving terrain of southern Utah had claimed yet another victim, though Willow was determined not to become a permanent addition to the growing tally of lives lost to the wild country. 3 days earlier, she had left behind everything familiar in scent. Louie, arriving in the small settlement of Tropic, Utah, with dreams of starting anew. Her inheritance money had purchased a modest plot of land sight unseen, but the stagecoach had dropped her miles from her destination when a wheel broke. Continue north, the driver had instructed before departing to seek repairs. You'll reach Tropic by nightfall. That had been yesterday morning. Now, as darkness threatened to envelop the landscape, Willow's situation had deteriorated from concerning to dire. The fall down the rocky slope had torn her dress and left a jagged wound that throbbed with every heartbeat. Her canteen lay empty beside her, and the distant howl of a coyote reminded her that predators would soon begin their nightly hunt. "Fool woman," she whispered through cracked lips. "You should have waited for the stage." But waiting had never been Willow's strong suit, not when she was fleeing the suffocating expectations of her former life and the scandal that had forced her westward. The sound of approaching hoofbeats jerked her from self-recrimination. Willow tensed, uncertain whether to call out or hide. In her vulnerable state, a stranger could mean salvation or something far worse. The hoofbeats slowed, and a low whistle cut through the gathering dusk. "That's quite a predicament you found yourself in, madam." The voice was deep, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. Willow looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. As he approached, features became clearer, a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a worn Stetson pulled low over his brow. "Xander Zimmerman," he offered simply, crouching beside her to examine the wound with clinical detachment. "Folks call me Xander." "Willow Ravenwood," she managed, wincing as he gently moved the torn fabric away from the injury. "I was headed to Tropic." He nodded once, saying nothing about her foolish decision to travel alone through unfamiliar territory. Instead, he reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a battered metal flask and a clean bandana. "This will sting," he warned, uncorking the flask. The sharp scent of whiskey hit her nostrils, and Willow braced herself, gripping the rough bark of the juniper. When the liquor hit her wound, she bit back a scream, her knuckles turning white. Xander worked efficiently, cleaning away dirt and blood with steady hands that belied their size and strength. Not once did he ask what a well-dressed woman was doing alone in the wilderness, nor did he comment on the expensive quality of her ruined clothing that suggested a background of privilege. "You're lucky," he said finally. "Deep but clean, no sign of infection yet." He produced a needle and thread from his kit, holding them up with a questioning glance. "I'm no doctor, but I've stitched up enough wounds to know what I'm doing." Willow nodded, unable to trust her voice. As he threaded the needle, she studied him more carefully. His clothes were worn but clean, his movements deliberate and confident. The gun at his hip looked well used but meticulously maintained, and the horse that stood patiently nearby was a magnificent buckskin stallion that spoke of a man who valued quality. "Take a swig," he suggested, offering the flask. "It helps." The whiskey burned a fiery trail down her throat, but it did indeed help dull the edge of pain as he began to stitch her wound with surprising gentleness. Throughout the procedure, he spoke of inconsequential things: the weather, the stubborn nature of junipers, the approaching spring, as if they were merely acquaintances passing time on a pleasant evening rather than strangers engaged in an intimate medical procedure beneath a darkening desert sky. When he finished, Xander bound the wound with a clean strip of cloth torn from his own spare shirt, then sat back on his heels, studying her face with those storm-gray eyes. "Tropic's still 10 miles north," he said. "You won't make it tonight, not with that leg." "I don't have much choice," Willow replied, attempting to stand and immediately realizing the folly of her determination as pain lanced through her thigh. Xander's hand steadied her elbow, his touch impersonal yet somehow reassuring. My cabin's about 2 miles east of here. It ain't much, but it's dry and warm. You can rest there tonight, and I'll take you to town tomorrow. Under normal circumstances, Willow would never have considered accepting such an offer from a stranger. But these were hardly normal circumstances, and something in his straightforward manner inspired a trust she rarely granted. Thank you, she said simply. He helped her onto his horse, then walked beside them, leading the buckskin through the gathering darkness with the confidence of a man who knew the land intimately. Stars emerged overhead, brilliant and countless in a way they never appeared in St. Louis, and despite her pain and exhaustion, Willow found herself marveling at their clarity. Beautiful, aren't they? Xander commented, following her gaze upward. That's one thing I never tire of out here. They seem closer somehow, Willow observed. They are. Up here, there's less between you and heaven. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just speaking of physical distance. His cabin appeared as they crested a small rise, a sturdy structure of logs and stone with a thin plume of smoke still rising from the chimney. A small corral stood nearby where 2 other horses raised their heads at their approach. Home sweet home, Xander said without irony as he helped her dismount. Her leg nearly buckled beneath her, and he caught her with firm hands, supporting her weight effortlessly. Careful now. Inside, the cabin was simple but unexpectedly tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its embers casting a warm glow across the room. A narrow bed with a colorful quilt occupied one corner, a rough-hewn table and chairs another. Shelves lined the walls, holding an impressive collection of books that seemed at odds with the rustic surroundings. Xander eased her into a chair near the fire, then busied himself adding logs and stoking the flames to life. Hungry? He asked, moving to a small kitchen area. Starving, Willow admitted, suddenly aware that she hadn't eaten since morning. He worked efficiently, producing a pot of stew that had been keeping warm at the edge of the hearth and slicing thick pieces of bread that he had clearly baked himself. The domesticity of the scene struck her, as oddly touching this solitary man in his well-ordered space, preparing a meal with the quiet competence he seemed to bring to every task. It's not fancy, he warned, setting a steaming bowl before her along with a spoon that had been polished smooth by years of use. The stew was simple but delicious tender venison, potatoes, carrots, and herbs she couldn't identify that filled the cabin with a savory aroma. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly and casting dancing shadows on the log walls. You have questions, Willow said finally, setting aside her empty bowl. Xander shrugged, his expression neutral. Everyone's entitled to their secrets, madam. I didn't ask because it isn't my place to know. Most men would be curious about a woman traveling alone. I'm not most men. There was no arrogance in the statement, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. And curiosity in these parts can be dangerous for the curious and the subject of their interest. This response intrigued her more than any prying questions might have. In her experience, people always wanted to know, to categorize, to judge. This man's deliberate restraint was something entirely new. You live here alone? She asked instead. He nodded. 4 years now, I raise horses, he added, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the corral. Sell them to the army mostly, sometimes to ranchers or travelers needing a reliable mount. It seems a solitary existence. Something flickered in his eyes, not defensiveness, but perhaps acknowledgement. It suits me. As the evening progressed, Willow found herself oddly comfortable in this stranger's home. Xander offered her the bed, insisting he would take the floor near the fire, and brought her extra blankets and a clean shirt to use as a nightgown. He stepped outside to give her privacy while she changed, and when he returned, he kept his eyes averted respectfully. Sleep well, Miss Ravenwood, he said, unrolling his bedroll a respectable distance from where she lay. We'll head to Tropic at first light. Thank you, she replied, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of this quiet man who had asked for nothing in return, for everything. His only response was a slight nod before he turned away, leaving her to wonder about the circumstances that had led him to this solitary life in the wilderness. Sleep came quickly, deeper than she'd experienced in months, perhaps aided by exhaustion and the lingering effects of whiskey. When Willow woke, sunlight was streaming through the single window and the scent of coffee filled the cabin. Xander stood at the stove, his back to her as he prepared breakfast. "Morning," he said without turning, somehow aware of her wakefulness. "How's the leg?" Willow shifted experimentally, wincing at the stiffness but noting that the sharp pain had subsided to a dull throb. "Better, I think." "Good, the stitches should hold if you're careful." He turned then, setting a plate of eggs and more of the fresh bread on the table. "Eat up." Town's a fair ride, even on a good day. As they ate, Willow found herself studying her host more openly than she had the night before. In daylight, she could see that he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with faint lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting against harsh sun rather than age. His hands were calloused but clean, and though his clothing was utilitarian, it was well maintained. "You're not what I expected," she said without thinking, one corner of his mouth quirked upward. "And what did you expect, Miss Ravenwood? I'm not sure, not someone who bakes his own bread and reads." She glanced at the spine of the book on the table, Thoreau. "A man contains multitudes," he quoted, surprising her yet again. Just like a woman might be more than a lost traveler with a wounded leg. The observation, gentle as it was, reminded her of her precarious situation. "I should tell you why I've come to Tropic." Xander shook his head. "Not necessary." "I want to," she insisted. "I've purchased land there. I intend to start a new life." He nodded, accepting this information without judgment. "Farming, a boarding house eventually. I have some savings, enough to build and furnish a proper place. Tropic is growing, and from what I understand, there's need for decent accommodation." "That's true enough. Town's expanding since they completed the irrigation system last year, more settlers arriving every month." He considered her thoughtfully. "It's hard work running a place like that. Especially alone." "I'm stronger than I look," Willow replied with a touch of defiance. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I don't doubt it, madam." After breakfast, Xander helped her onto his buckskin, then mounted a second horse, a sleek bay mare with intelligent eyes. They rode side by side through terrain that seemed less forbidding in daylight, though no less majestic. Willow found herself marveling at the stark beauty of the landscape, the towering red rock formations, the unexpected bursts of wildflowers in sheltered valleys, the vast expanse of sky overhead. "You love it here," she observed as Xander paused to point out a distant herd of pronghorn antelope. "It grows on you," he admitted. "Took me a while to see past the harshness, but there's beauty in it, and honesty. The land doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." "Unlike people," Willow said softly. He glanced at her, those storm-gray eyes seeming to see more than she wanted to reveal. "Unlike most," he agreed. As they crested a rise, the settlement of Tropic came into view, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with fields of newly planted crops spreading outward from its center like green fingers against the red earth. "There it is," Xander said. "Your new beginning." Something in his tone made Willow look at him sharply, but his expression revealed nothing. They rode in silence down the gentle slope toward the town, and she found herself suddenly reluctant to reach their destination. This quiet man with his gentle hands and unasked questions had become, in the space of a day, someone whose company she valued. The main street of Tropic was bustling with activity wagons loaded with supplies, women shopping at the general store, men gathered outside the saloon despite the early hour. Heads turned as they rode in, curious gazes taking in Willow's makeshift attire and bandaged leg. Xander guided them to a whitewashed building with a sign declaring Dr. Joseph Miller, physician, in neat black letters. "The doc should take a look at that leg," he said, dismounting and coming to help her down. His hands on her waist were steady and impersonal, but Willow found herself aware of their warmth through the thin fabric of her borrowed shirt. "Thank you," she said as her feet touched the ground. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need," he replied, looking uncomfortable for the first time since they'd met. "Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true. Before he could respond, the door of the doctor's office opened, and a middle-aged man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard stepped out. "Xander," he greeted, then looked curiously at Willow. "What brings you to town? Miss Ravenwood had an accident yesterday. I stitched her up, but thought you should take a look." The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course. Come in, please." Xander hesitated on the threshold. "I should see to some supplies while I'm here. You'll come back?" Willow asked, suddenly anxious at the thought of being left alone in this unfamiliar place. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes. "If you'd like." "I would." He nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the street, the spurs on his boots jingling softly with each step. Dr. Miller proved to be both competent and kind, examining Xander's handiwork with professional interest. "These are well done," he commented, rebandaging the wound after applying a soothing salve. "Not the first time he stitched someone up, I'd wager." "He was very helpful," Willow replied, curious but unwilling to pry. The doctor helped her into a chair, his expression thoughtful. "Xander's a good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's always ready to lend a hand when needed. Town wouldn't be the same without him, though he probably doesn't realize it. He lives quite far out," Willow observed, "by choice. He came here 4 years back, didn't say much about where from or why. Bought that parcel of land nobody wanted because it was too rocky for farming and turned it into a respectable horse operation." The doctor smiled slightly. "People wondered about him at first. Lone man, clearly educated, choosing to live so isolated, but he's proved himself a dozen times over." Willow digested this information, finding it aligned with her own impressions of the quiet cowboy. "I've purchased land here myself," she said. "The old Hendricks property, I believe it's called." Dr. Miller's eyebrows rose. "That's a fine piece of land, right on the edge of town, good well, solid foundation still in place after the fire took the original house." He studied her with renewed interest. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings a young woman like yourself to Tropic? We're hardly on the main thoroughfare." "A new start," she said simply, unwilling to elaborate on the circumstances that had driven her west. To his credit, the doctor didn't press. "Well, you're welcome here. Town could use more enterprising folks." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Xander stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable in the clinical setting. "Doc," he nodded. "Miss Ravenwood, I've taken the liberty of speaking with Mrs. Turner at the boarding house. She has a room available until your property is ready for habitation." Willow was touched by this thoughtfulness. "Thank you. I've also located your land," he continued. "It's in good condition, all things considered. The foundation is solid, as I suspect you knew." "I had reports," she confirmed, "but it's good to have confirmation from someone trustworthy." Something flickered in his eyes at the word trustworthy, but he merely nodded. "If you're finished here, I can take you to Mrs. Turner's." Dr. Miller helped her to her feet. "You should rest that leg for a few days, but the stitches can come out in about 10 days. Come see me then, or sooner if there's any sign of infection." Outside, Xander had already loaded her few belongings onto his horse. "Mrs. Turner's is just down the street," he explained, offering his arm for support. As they walked slowly along the wooden sidewalk, Willow was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. A woman in men's clothing, leaning on the arm of Tropic's reclusive horse breeder, was clearly an unusual sight. "People are staring," she murmured. "Small town," Xander replied with a slight shrug. "They'll have something new to talk about by supper time." The boarding house was a neat 2-story structure with a wide porch and window boxes filled with early spring flowers. Mrs. Turner herself, a plump, pleasant-faced woman in her 50s, greeted them at the door, her eyes widening slightly at Willow's appearance but quickly masked with a professional smile. "Miss Ravenwood, welcome to Tropic. Mr. Zimmerman explained your situation. I have a lovely room ready for you, and I've sent for some clothing from the general store since he mentioned yours was damaged in the accident." "That's very kind, thank you," Willow said, touched by the woman's thoughtfulness. Mrs. Turner bustled ahead up the stairs, chattering about meal times and the other boarders, leaving Willow and Xander briefly alone in the entryway. "I should be going," he said, looking uncomfortable again. "Will I see you again?" Willow asked before she could reconsider the boldness of the question. Xander studied her face for a long moment. I come into town every week or so for supplies. I'd like to thank you properly, perhaps with dinner, once I'm settled. A faint smile touched his lips. No need for thanks, but I wouldn't refuse a meal not cooked by my own hand. Then it's settled. Willow extended her hand, and after a brief hesitation, he took it. His palm was warm and rough against her smoother skin, and she felt an unexpected reluctance to let go. "Good day, Miss Ravenwood," he said softly, releasing her hand and stepping back. "Good day, Mr. Zimmerman." He settled his hat on his head and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Be careful on those stairs with that leg," he said, then was gone before she could reply. Mrs. Turner reappeared at the top of the staircase. "Your room is ready, dear. Do you need help with the stairs?" "I think I can manage," Willow replied, her eyes still on the door through which Xander had disappeared. With a small sigh, she turned and began the slow ascent to her temporary home. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a cheerful quilt, a small dresser, and a washstand. A window overlooked the main street, providing a view of the bustling little town that was to be her new home. "The bathroom is at the end of the hall," Mrs. Turner explained. "Dinner is at 6 sharp. We're having beef stew tonight." "Thank you," Willow said sincerely, "for taking me in on such short notice." The older woman patted her hand. "That's what neighbors do, dear. Now rest that leg. I'll send up some tea shortly." Left alone, Willow sank onto the bed, the events of the past 2 days catching up to her in a rush of exhaustion. From the fall that might have claimed her life to the quiet cowboy who had saved it without asking for anything in return, her introduction to Tropic had been far from what she had anticipated. As she drifted toward sleep, her last conscious thought was of storm-gray eyes and gentle hands that had tended her wounds with such care. The days that followed settled into a routine as Willow recovered and began to establish herself in Tropic. Mrs. Turner proved to be not only a gracious hostess, but a valuable source of information about the town and its inhabitants. Through her, Willow learned more about the community she had chosen to join, its history, its challenges, and its people. "Irrigation changed everything," Mrs. Turner explained over breakfast one morning, a week after Willow's arrival. "Before that, it was just a handful of stubborn families trying to scratch a living from the desert. Now we're growing, adding new businesses every year." "Including mine, I hope," Willow said, spreading butter on a warm biscuit. "Lord knows we need proper accommodations," the older woman agreed. "My little place serves well enough for single folks and temporary visitors, but we get families passing through who need more space. Your boarding house will be a blessing." With Mrs. Turner's help, Willow had already made contact with the town's only builder, a no-nonsense man named Franklin Porter, who had agreed to begin construction as soon as her leg was healed enough for her to properly supervise. In the meantime, she ordered furnishings from Salt Lake City and planned the layout of what would become the juniper inn named for the tree under which Xander had found her. Xander himself remained absent, though Willow found her thoughts returning to him often. She had expected him to appear in town for supplies, as he'd mentioned, but as the days passed with no sign of him, she began to wonder if she had somehow misinterpreted their parting. On the 10th day after her accident, Willow returned to Dr. Miller to have her stitches removed. The procedure was quick and relatively painless, and the doctor pronounced her healing nicely. "Any sign of Xander in town?" she asked as casually as she could manage while adjusting her skirts. The doctor's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Not since he brought you in. But that's not unusual. He sometimes goes a month or more between visits, especially in spring when he's busy with new foals." "Of course," Willow said, feeling foolish for her disappointment. "I just wanted to thank him properly." Dr. Miller studied her thoughtfully. "You know, his place isn't that far if you're determined to deliver those thanks in person. Any of the livery horses could make the trip easily now that your leg is healing." The suggestion caught her by surprise. "Would that be appropriate? This isn't St. Louis, Miss Ravenwood," the doctor replied with a gentle smile. "Out here, we make our own rules about what's appropriate. Besides, you wouldn't be the first woman to visit Xander's place. Mrs. Porter delivers eggs to him every other week." The comparison to a married woman's business transaction wasn't entirely reassuring, but Willow found herself considering the possibility nonetheless. Her leg was much improved, and the thought of sitting idle for another week while waiting for construction to begin was unappealing. That afternoon, she visited the livery stable and arranged to rent a gentle mare for the following day. The stable owner, a weathered man named Jackson, provided detailed directions to Xander's property. "It's an easy ride," he assured her. "Just follow the creek east out of town for about 5 miles, then look for the split boulder that looks like a bear's head. His lane starts there, marked by a juniper post." Willow thanked him and returned to the boarding house to prepare for her journey. Mrs. Turner, upon hearing of her plans, packed a basket of fresh bread, preserves, and cold chicken. "Men living alone never eat properly," she declared, tucking in a jar of pickled beans. "Take these with my compliments, and wear your sturdiest shoes. It's still muddy in places after last week's rain." Morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for riding. Willow dressed in her most practical skirt and a simple blouse, adding a light shawl that could be removed as the day warmed. Her leg, though still tender, supported her weight without pain. As she mounted the mare Jackson had selected for her, a placid chestnut named Penny, who seemed content to amble along at an unhurried pace. The ride followed the creek as promised, winding through terrain that seemed gentler in daylight and on horseback than it had during her desperate trek on foot. Spring wildflowers dotted the landscape in unexpected bursts of color, and birds darted among the scattered trees. The bear-shaped boulder proved impossible to miss, rising prominently against the eastern sky, and Willow turned Penny onto the narrow track that led toward Xander's cabin. As she approached, the sound of hammering reached her ears, and she rounded a bend to find him working on an extension to his corral. He wore no shirt despite the cool morning air, his tan skin gleaming with sweat as he drove posts into the hard ground. The sight sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the strengthening sun. Penny nickered a greeting, and Xander straightened, turning toward the sound. Surprise registered on his face, followed by something that might have been pleasure before his expression settled into careful neutrality. "Miss Ravenwood," he acknowledged, reaching for the shirt that hung from a nearby fence post. "This is unexpected." "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, suddenly uncertain of her decision to come unannounced. "Not at all." He buttoned his shirt with efficient movements, then approached to help her dismount. "How's the leg?" "Much improved. Dr. Miller removed the stitches yesterday." His hands were warm at her waist as he lifted her down, and Willow found herself flustered by the proximity. Up close, he smelled of clean sweat and leather, and she could see flecks of gold in his gray eyes that she hadn't noticed before. "I brought lunch," she said quickly, gesturing to the basket tied to Penny's saddle. "As a thank you," a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You rode all this way to deliver a meal and to see how you were. You didn't come into town as you mentioned you might." Xander untied the basket, then led Penny to a water trough near the corral. "Spring's a busy time. New foals, fences needing repair after winter snow." He paused, giving her a sidelong glance. "And I wasn't sure my presence would be welcome once you'd settled in." The admission surprised her. "Why wouldn't it be?" he shrugged, his gaze shifting to the distant mountains. "You're establishing yourself as a respectable businesswoman. Association with a solitary horse breeder of unknown background might not serve your interests." Willow stared at him, understanding dawning. "You stayed away for my benefit. That's ridiculous." "Is it? Small towns have long memories and longer tongues. I don't care what people think," she said with more vehemence than she'd intended. "I've had my fill of living according to others' expectations." Something shifted in his expression at that, a softening, perhaps, or recognition. "Then I'm glad you came," he said simply. "Would you like to see the new foals? The last one arrived just yesterday." The change of subject was obvious but welcome, and Willow nodded, following him toward a smaller enclosure beyond the main corral. Inside, 3 mares grazed peacefully, each with a gangly foal at her side. The newest addition was still wobbly on its long legs, staying close to its mother's protective presence. "They're beautiful," Willow breathed, leaning on the fence to watch the foals' playful interactions. "What will you do with them?" train them eventually. The army buys most of my stock, but I keep the best for breeding. That little filly there, he pointed to a chestnut with a white blaze, she has potential. Good bone structure, alert eyes, she'll make a fine foundation mare in a few years. The pride in his voice was evident, and Willow found herself enchanted by this glimpse into his passion. You love them, she observed. Horses make sense, he replied. They're honest in their needs and responses, no pretense. Unlike people, she echoed their earlier conversation. He glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Some people are honest too, just harder to find. They watched the horses in companionable silence for a while longer, then Xander suggested they eat. He led her to a small clearing near the cabin where a flat boulder served as a natural table, with smaller stones arranged as seats. My dining room, he explained with a self-deprecating smile. When the weather permits, Mrs. Turner's basket yielded its bounty, supplemented by fresh coffee that Xander brewed over a small fire. They ate amid easy conversation, discussing the town, her plans for the boarding house, his horse's neutral topics that nevertheless allowed Willow glimpses of the man behind the reserved exterior. You're not from Texas originally, she observed as he described breaking a particularly stubborn stallion. Your accent slips sometimes. Xander paused, a flicker of wariness crossing his features before he nodded. Virginia, originally, left after the war. The brevity of his response suggested this was territory he preferred not to explore, but Willow's curiosity was piqued. You fought Confederate cavalry, he confirmed, his expression closing slightly. Not something I'm proud of these days. Willow considered this. The war had ended 13 years ago when Xander would have been barely more than a boy. You were very young, old enough to know better, young enough to be foolish. He stared into his coffee cup. I believed what I was raised to believe until I saw enough to know it was wrong. The admission seemed to cost him something, and Willow realized this might be the first time he had spoken of it to anyone in Tropic. The war changed many minds, she said gently, and hearts. He looked up, searching her face for judgment and apparently finding none. Some changes come at high cost. Is that why you came west? To start fresh? Xander nodded slowly. My family disowned me when I refused to return to the plantation after the surrender. I wandered for years, worked as a ranch hand in Texas, learned about horses. Saved enough to buy this land eventually. His mouth quirked in a humorless smile, fitting that no one else wanted it. Because it was difficult, Willow asked, because it required seeing past the obvious. This land looks harsh and unforgiving, but there's good water underground and protected valleys for grazing. He gestured toward the surrounding landscape. Most folks just saw rocks and junipers. While you saw possibility, she finished for him. As did you with that burned-out property in town. The parallel struck her, and Willow smiled. Perhaps we're more alike than not, Mr. Zimmerman. Perhaps we are, Miss Ravenwood. He hesitated, then added, though I suspect your reasons for seeking a fresh start differ from mine. It was an opening, not a demand, and Willow found herself wanting to share the truth with this man who had offered her his own. I was engaged, she said, looking down at her hands, to a man my parents approved of, wealthy, from a good family, politically connected. Everything a young woman is supposed to want. But not what you wanted, Xander guessed softly. I thought it was, at first. William was charming, attentive. It wasn't until after the engagement was announced that I began to see another side of him, controlling, quick to anger, determined that I should abandon my interests in favor of becoming the perfect society wife. Xander's expression darkened. He hurt you. Not physically, Willow assured him quickly. But there are other kinds of harm. He diminished me, made me doubt myself. And when I finally found the courage to break the engagement, he spread rumors that destroyed my reputation. She shook her head, remembering the whispers, the averted gazes, the former friends who suddenly had no room for her in their social calendars. What kind of rumors? Xander asked, his voice carefully neutral. Willow felt heat rise in her cheeks. That I had been improper with another man. That he had caught us and ended the engagement because of my indiscretion. But that wasn't true. No, The irony is that my actual transgression was far more threatening to men like William. I had started writing articles for the newspaper under a pen name, advocating for women's suffrage. She smiled bitterly. Apparently, political opinions are more scandalous than moral failings, at least for a woman. Xander was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Your articles, were they any good? The unexpected question startled a laugh from her. The editor seemed to think so. He was disappointed when I told him I was leaving St. Louis. Will you write here? I hadn't planned to, Willow admitted, but perhaps once the boarding house is established, Tropic could use more perspectives, Xander said. Our newspaper prints mostly cattle prices and church announcements. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Willow felt a new ease between them, as if the sharing of confidences had removed an invisible barrier. As the afternoon progressed, Xander gave her a tour of his property, showing her the spring-fed pond where he watered his stock, the workshop where he crafted his own saddles, and finally, the small orchard he had planted behind the cabin. Apple trees this far south? She asked, surprised. A special variety bred for heat tolerance, he explained, touching a branch where tiny buds were just beginning to form. They won't fruit for another year or two, but eventually. Eventually, you'll have apples, Willow finished, struck by the patience this represented, the willingness to invest in something that wouldn't yield rewards for years to come. That's the thing about trees, Xander said softly. You plant them knowing you might not be the one to harvest. It's an act of faith. Their eyes met, and Willow felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding. For a moment, she thought he might move closer, might touch her face with those gentle hands that had tended her wounds with such care. But the moment passed, and he stepped back, gesturing toward the western sky where the sun was beginning its descent. You should start back soon, he said. I wouldn't want you caught out after dark. Disappointment pricked at her, though she knew he was right. Of course. Thank you for showing me your home. As she mounted Penny for the return journey, Xander stood beside the mare, one hand resting lightly on the saddle. Will you come again? He asked, his voice betraying uncertainty that she found oddly endearing in such a self-contained man. If I'm welcome, Willow replied. You are. His hand brushed hers briefly as he handed her the reins. Always. The ride back to Tropic seemed shorter somehow, filled as it was with reflections on the day and the man she had left behind. Xander Zimmerman was unlike anyone she had known in St. Louis, direct yet gentle, principled yet understanding, carrying the weight of his past without being defined by it. And something about his quiet strength and unassuming kindness called to her in a way that William's polished charm never had. As the buildings of Tropic came into view, Willow found herself wondering what it might be like to share more than conversation with such a man, to feel those capable hands on her skin in passion rather than medical necessity, to wake beside him in the morning light. The thoughts brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the exertion of riding. Mrs. Turner greeted her return with poorly disguised curiosity, which Willow satisfied with a carefully edited account of her visit. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house, sleep eluded her, her mind filled with images of storm-gray eyes and an orchard planted as an act of faith. The following weeks brought significant changes to Willow's life in Tropic. Construction began on her boarding house, with Franklin Porter and his crew raising the frame of what would become a 2-story structure with 8 guest rooms, a spacious dining room, and comfortable parlor. Willow threw herself into the project, overseeing every detail from the placement of windows to the width of the front porch. True to his word, Xander began appearing in town regularly, usually timing his visits to coincide with her lunch breaks from supervising construction. They would share simple meals at the small cafe near the general store, drawing curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing the reclusive horse breeder so regularly or so animated in conversation. On one such occasion, as they lingered over coffee, the town's newspaper editor approached their table, hat in hand. Miss Ravenwood, Mr. Zimmerman, he greeted them, nodding respectfully. Pardon the interruption. I'm Thomas Whitaker, editor of the Tropic Tribune. Willow smiled, extending her hand. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Whitaker. I've been reading your paper since my arrival. That's actually why I wanted to speak with you, the editor replied, looking somewhat embarrassed. Word has reached me through Mrs. Turner. I admit that you have some experience writing for a newspaper back east. Xander shot her a quick glance, one eyebrow raised in amusement. I did contribute some articles in St. Louis, Willow acknowledged cautiously. The thing is, Whitaker continued, I'm in something of a bind. My assistant has left for Salt Lake City, rather suddenly family emergency, and I'm struggling to fill the paper each week. I wondered if you might consider contributing occasionally. Nothing political, he added hastily. Perhaps articles on Eastern fashions, household tips, that sort of thing. Willow felt a flicker of disappointment at the suggested topics, so similar to the limitations she had faced initially in St. Louis. Before she could formulate a diplomatic response, Xander spoke up. Miss Ravenwood's articles in St. Louis focused on women's suffrage, Mr. Whitaker. I believe her expertise lies more in substantive issues than fashion notes. Whitaker's eyebrows rose in surprise, both at the content of Xander's statement and the fact that he had spoken at all. The horse breeder was not known for inserting himself into conversations with strangers. I had no idea, the editor stammered. That's certainly interesting. Would you like to read some of my previous work? Willow offered, sensing an opportunity. I have copies of several articles. I would, yes, Whitaker replied, seeming to recover his professional curiosity. Perhaps you could bring them by the office tomorrow. We might discuss what would be appropriate for our readership. After he departed, Willow turned to Xander with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Thank you for speaking up. He shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with her appreciation. I just stated facts. Your writing deserves recognition for what it is, not what someone assumes it should be because you're a woman. Still, it was kind. She studied him across the table, this quiet man who continued to surprise her with his depth and complexity. Would you like to read my articles as well? Something flickered in his eyes, pleasure, perhaps, at being included in this part of her life. I would, very much. That evening, Willow sorted through her trunk, retrieving the carefully preserved newspaper clippings that represented her brief but meaningful career as W.R. Justice, contributor to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Reading them now, she found herself proud of the measured but firm arguments she had made for women's equality under the law, even as she recognized the caution that had colored her early efforts. The next morning, she presented copies to both Whitaker and Xander, then waited anxiously for their responses. The editor, to his credit, approached her work with an open mind, and by the end of their meeting, had invited her to contribute a monthly column on matters of social progress, a delicate phrasing that would allow her to address women's rights without directly challenging the more conservative elements of Tropic's population. Xander's response came later that afternoon, as she supervised the installation of the boarding house's main staircase. He arrived on horseback, dismounting with fluid grace and approaching with an intensity of expression that made her heart quicken. Your articles, he said without preamble, are excellent, reasoned, persuasive, compassionate. He shook his head slightly. I'm amazed they allowed you to publish them, even under a pen name. The editor was unusually progressive, Willow explained, warmed by his evident admiration. And I was careful to couch my arguments in terms of family benefits rather than individual rights, at least at first. Strategic, Xander observed with approval. But the later pieces show your true convictions more clearly. That last one about property rights that must have ruffled feathers. It did, she admitted. It was published just before everything changed. She didn't need to elaborate. He understood she referred to the broken engagement and subsequent scandal. Xander's expression hardened. Your former fiancé saw it. And realized I would never be the biddable wife he wanted, Willow confirmed. The public humiliation was his revenge. His loss, Xander said softly. Then, with a deliberate change of subject, he gestured toward the half-built boarding house. This is coming along well. They walked through the structure together, Willow pointing out features and explaining her vision for each space. Xander listened attentively, offering practical suggestions about drainage and insulation that revealed his own experience with construction. "You've built before," she observed as they stood in what would become the parlor, sunlight streaming through the empty window frames. "Added onto my cabin twice," he confirmed, "and helped neighbors with barns and root cellars. You learn a bit of everything out here. Would you?" Willow hesitated, then continued, "Would you help me with some of the finishing work? Mr. Porter is excellent with the structural elements, but I'd value your eye for the details." The invitation seemed to please him. "I'd be honored." As spring progressed into summer, Xander became a familiar presence at the construction site, arriving most afternoons after tending to his horses. He built bookshelves for the parlor, crafted a registration desk of polished pine, and designed a clever system of pulleys to make opening the high windows easier. His quiet competence impressed even Franklin Porter, who began consulting him on other aspects of the project. Their working relationship gradually evolved into something deeper as they shared meals, conversations, and the satisfaction of creating something lasting. Willow found herself looking forward to his arrivals each day, her pulse quickening at the sight of his tall figure approaching from the direction of the livery stable, where he now kept a horse specifically for his trips to town. The townspeople, initially curious about their association, gradually accepted it as routine. Mrs. Turner, more perceptive than most, observed the changing dynamics with knowing eyes but kept her comments to herself, merely ensuring that her weekly deliveries to Xander's ranch always included enough food for two. By mid-July, the Juniper Inn was nearing completion. The exterior was painted a warm cream with green trim, wide porches wrapped around three sides, and inside, the rooms were taking shape with their simple but comfortable furnishings. Willow had hired a local woman as cook and housekeeper, and bookings were already being accepted for the grand opening in August. On a particularly warm evening, as they sat on the inn's front porch after a long day of work, Willow found herself studying Xander's profile in the golden light of sunset. He had changed subtly since their first meeting. His face was more relaxed, his rare smiles came more frequently, and he spoke more freely of his thoughts and experiences. "What will you do when this is finished?" he asked suddenly, turning to catch her watching him. The question took her by surprise. "Run the inn, of course, write my column, build a life here. Will it be enough?" His expression was serious, his eyes searching hers. "After St. Louis, after all your aspirations there?" Willow considered this, understanding the deeper question he was asking. "My aspirations haven't changed," she said carefully. "I still believe in equality and justice in progress, but I've learned that meaningful change can happen anywhere, not just in big cities. Even in Tropic, Utah, especially in places like Tropic," she insisted. "Ideas take root in small communities, grow stronger, spread outward. My column may reach fewer readers here, but perhaps it will matter more to those who do read it." Xander nodded slowly, seeming satisfied with her answer. "You belong here," he said, not as a question but as a realization. "I think I do," Willow agreed, feeling the truth of it in her bones. This town, these people, this life she was building, it felt more genuine than anything she had known in St. Louis, despite its simplicity. Or perhaps because of it. They sat in companionable silence as the sun slipped below the western mountains, casting long shadows across the newly planted garden. A thought occurred to Willow, one that had been forming gradually over weeks of working together. "The opening celebration for the inn," she began. "It's to be quite an event. The whole town is invited." "So I've heard," Xander replied, amusement coloring his voice. "Mrs. Turner has spoken of little else for weeks. Would you?" Willow hesitated, then continued with more confidence. "Would you attend as my personal guest? Not just as a townsperson, but as my escort for the evening." The invitation hung between them, its implications clear. To appear together publicly at such an event would signal a relationship beyond friendship, beyond the working partnership they had established. It would be a declaration of sorts. Xander was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and earnest. "Are you certain that's what you want, Willow?" "I'm not. I don't fit easily into social gatherings, and there will be talk." "Let them talk," she replied with sudden fierceness. I care for you, Xander, more than I thought possible after. After everything, I'm not ashamed of that, nor will I hide it to satisfy propriety. He turned to face her fully then, reaching out to take her hand in his. I care for you too, he said simply. More than I have words to express, but your reputation is my concern, not yours, she interrupted. And I'd rather be known as the woman who loves the reclusive horse breeder than as someone who denies her own heart for the sake of appearances. The word love slipped out unplanned, hanging in the air between them like a tangible thing. Xander's eyes widened slightly, then softened with an emotion that made Willow's breath catch. In that case, he said, his voice rough with feeling, I would be honored to escort you. His hand tightened around hers. And Willow, yes, I love you too. Have since you sat at my table with your wounded leg and spoke of starting anew, unafraid despite everything you'd lost. The confession, so plainly stated, filled her with a joy that seemed too large for her body to contain. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle touch that conveyed what words could not. Xander remained still for a heartbeat, then responded, his free hand coming up to cradle her face with exquisite tenderness. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Willow felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her world, as if everything before had been preparation for this moment, this man, this life she was choosing. Well, she said softly, unable to suppress her smile, that settles it, doesn't it? Xander's answering smile transformed his usually serious face, revealing a glimpse of the young man he must have been before war and disillusionment had shaped him. I believe it does. The weeks leading up to the inn's opening passed in a whirl of activity as final preparations were completed. Linens were delivered, kitchen equipment installed, staff trained, and advertisements placed in newspapers as far away as Salt Lake City. Throughout it all, Xander remained Willow's steadfast support, offering practical assistance and emotional reassurance in equal measure. Their relationship, no longer confined to private conversations and shared work, became a topic of gentle speculation in Tropic. Some, like Mrs. Turner and Dr. Miller, observed the development with approval. Others, particularly those who had hoped to court the new businesswoman themselves, were less enthusiastic but generally respectful. Only the widow Lancaster, a formidable presence in the town's small social circle, expressed open disapproval, cornering Willow after church one Sunday with warnings about men with mysterious pasts and the importance of suitable connections for a business dependent on public opinion. Willow listened politely, then replied with a smile that belied the steel in her voice. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Lancaster. However, I judge people by their actions toward me and others, not by the circumstances of their birth or the opinions of those who barely know them. Mr. Zimmerman has proven himself a man of integrity and kindness, which I value above all other qualities. The exchange, witnessed by several churchgoers, quickly became known throughout Tropic, elevating Willow's standing among those who had harbored reservations about the Eastern newcomer. Her willingness to defend Xander against the town's most influential gossip demonstrated both loyalty and courage, traits highly valued in frontier communities where interdependence was crucial for survival. The morning of the grand opening dawned clear and perfect, with a crispness in the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Willow rose early, too excited to sleep, and walked through the completed inn with a sense of wonder and accomplishment. Every room stood ready, beds made with fresh linens, curtains hanging at sparkling windows, lamps filled and chimneys cleaned. In the dining room, tables were set with the simple but elegant dishes she had ordered from Denver, and the kitchen hummed with activity as Mrs. Hayes, the cook, prepared for the evening's celebration. As Willow inspected the registration desk, Xander's creation, with its beautifully dovetailed corners and smooth finish, a knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a deliveryman holding a small wooden crate. Package for Miss Ravenwood, he announced, consulting his clipboard. From Salt Lake City. Puzzled, Willow signed for the delivery and carried the crate to the desk. She had ordered nothing recently that she could recall. Using a letter opener, she carefully pried open the lid to reveal a polished brass plaque nestled in wood shavings. The Juniper Inn, it read in elegant lettering, established 1878 Willow Ravenwood, proprietress. Beneath the plaque lay a note in Xander's distinctive handwriting. For your door a permanent mark of your courage and vision. With love and admiration, X. Tears pricked at Willow's eyes as she traced the letters with her fingertip. The plaque represented more than just a sign for her business. It was a tangible acknowledgement of her new life, her independence, her future in this place. That Xander had thought to provide such a meaningful gift touched her deeply. Later that afternoon, as she dressed for the evening's festivities in a new gown of deep green, silk and extravagance ordered from Salt Lake City, Willow reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The painful ending in St. Louis that had become a beginning in Tropic. The fall that might have claimed her life, but instead had led her to Xander. The wounds, both physical and emotional, that had healed in the clear air of this small desert town. A knock at the boarding house door signaled Xander's arrival to escort her to the inn. Mrs. Turner showed him into the small parlor where Willow waited, and the older woman's delighted exclamation made Willow turn in surprise. Xander stood in the doorway, transformed from the working man she knew into a figure of unexpected elegance. He wore a new black suit that fit his tall frame perfectly, a crisp white shirt and a string tie. His hair, usually somewhat unruly, was neatly trimmed and combed, and his face was freshly shaved. Only his eyes remained unchanged, those storm-gray eyes that now regarded her with undisguised admiration. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "As do you," she replied, drinking in the sight of him. "I didn't know you owned a suit." A slight smile touched his lips. "I didn't until yesterday." Seemed appropriate for the occasion. Mrs. Turner, beaming at them both, fetched Willow's shawl and shooed them toward the door. "Go on now, your guests will be arriving soon and you should be there to greet them." The walk to the inn was short but memorable, with townspeople calling greetings and good wishes as they passed. Xander offered his arm, and Willow placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. They made in striking pair, the tall, distinguished-looking man, and the elegant woman in her silk gown, and Willow was acutely aware of the admiring glances they received. "Thank you for the plaque," she said as they approached the inn. "It's perfect. I had it made in Salt Lake when I went to select breeding stock last month," he explained. "The craftsman thought I was mad when I insisted it had to include the juniper reference." "It couldn't be anything else," Willow agreed, squeezing his arm gently. "That tree changed everything." The celebration exceeded even Willow's optimistic expectations. The entire town seemed to turn out, filling the inn's public rooms with laughter and conversation. The mayor gave a short speech welcoming the new establishment, and Thomas Whitaker announced a special edition of the Tribune would feature photographs of the event. Mrs. Hayes's elaborate buffet earned universal praise, especially her berry pies made with fruit gathered from the surrounding hills. Throughout the evening, Willow moved among her guests, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about accommodations. Xander remained close, his quiet presence a reassuring anchor as she navigated her first major social event as a business owner. He spoke little to those he didn't know well, but Willow noticed he made a special effort with her staff and the tradespeople who had contributed to the inn's construction. As the festivities began to wind down, Dr. Miller raised his glass in a final toast. "To Miss Ravenwood and the Juniper in May, they both flourish in Tropic for many years to come." The guests echoed the sentiment enthusiastically, and Willow found herself blinking back tears of gratitude and happiness. This was what she had hoped for when she fled St. Louis, not just escape from scandal, but a true sense of belonging, of contributing something meaningful to a community that valued her presence. Later, after the last guest had departed and the staff had retired, Willow and Xander stood alone in the quiet parlor. A few lamps still burned, casting a warm glow over the room that would soon welcome travelers from near and far. "You did it," Xander said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "From wounded stranger to respected business owner in less than 6 months. It's remarkable." I had help, she reminded him, reaching for his hand. I couldn't have done this without you. You would have found a way, he insisted. You're the most determined woman I've ever known. Perhaps, Willow conceded, but I'm glad I didn't have to. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. What happens now? With us? Xander's expression grew serious as he took both her hands in his. That depends on what you want, Willow. I know what I want, but I won't presume. Tell me, she urged when he faltered. What do you want? He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. I want a life with you, marriage if you'll have me, children eventually, mornings and evenings and all the moments in between. A touch of uncertainty entered his voice. But I know you value your independence, your business. I wouldn't ask you to give those up. And I wouldn't want to, Willow confirmed. But marriage doesn't have to mean surrendering myself or my work, not with the right partner. She stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face. And you, Xander Zimmerman, are very much the right partner. Relief and joy washed across his features. Is that a yes? It's a yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it, marriage, children, a life together. He gathered her into his arms then, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure, his face buried in her hair. I never thought to find this, he murmured. Not after everything, not here in this unlikely place. Nor did I, Willow admitted, her cheek pressed against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. But perhaps that's why it worked, because neither of us was looking, just living as honestly as we could. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the town's small church. Willow wore a dress of pale blue silk rather than traditional white, explaining to a scandalized Mrs. Lancaster that at 26, she was well past the age where white seemed appropriate. Xander, again in his black suit, looked both solemn and joyful as he spoke his vows in a clear voice that carried to the farthest pew. The reception was held at the Juniper Inn, now operating successfully, with its first paying guests discreetly accommodated in the East Wing, while celebrations took place in the main parlor. Mrs. Hayes outdid herself with a wedding feast that featured local game, vegetables from Tropics Gardens, and a 3-tiered cake decorated with fresh wildflowers. As evening approached, the newlyweds slipped away, boarding a waiting buggy for the journey to Xander's ranch, their home now, though Willow would maintain an apartment at the inn for nights when business required her presence in town. The property had been transformed in preparation for her arrival, with new curtains at the windows, a larger bed in the bedroom, and bookshelves built to accommodate her extensive collection. But the most significant change was the grove of saplings planted along the eastern side of the cabin, a wedding gift from the townspeople, each tree representing a family's good wishes for the couple's future. In years to come, they would provide shade, fruit, and a living reminder of the community's embrace of both the eastern newcomer and the once reclusive horse breeder. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Xander traced the faint scar on Willow's thigh with gentle fingers. I'm glad you fell, he whispered, pressing a kiss to the healed wound. Terrible as that sounds. I'm glad you found me, she replied, running her hands through his hair, and that you never asked questions. I was afraid you'd disappear if I pried too deeply. And now. He raised himself on one elbow to look down at her, his expression visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. Now I know you're staying, but I'll still never ask more than you want to tell. I want to tell you everything, Willow assured him, pulling him close. We have a lifetime for questions and answers. A lifetime, he echoed, the wonder in his voice matching the feeling in her heart. That sounds just about right. Autumn passed into winter, winter into spring, and the rhythm of their shared life settled into patterns both comfortable and exhilarating. Willow's boarding house flourished, developing a reputation for cleanliness, excellent meals, and the proprietress's engaging conversation. Her monthly column in the Tribune expanded to a weekly feature as readers from surrounding communities wrote in with questions and comments, creating a dialogue that extended far beyond Tropics' boundaries. Xander's horse breeding operation likewise prospered, with his stock commanding premium prices from buyers who recognized their superior training and bloodlines. He began taking on apprentices, young men eager to learn his methods, and built additional cabins on his property to house them, creating a small community where once he had lived in solitude. Their personal happiness found expression in 1,000 small ways in the garden they planted together, in the evenings spent reading aloud by the fire, in the comfortable silences that required no words to fill. And when, in their second year of marriage, Willow discovered she was expecting a child, their joy seemed to spill outward, touching everyone around them. The baby, a boy they named James Thomas Zimmerman, arrived in the early hours of a spring morning in 1881, with Dr. Miller attending and Mrs. Turner serving as midwife. Xander, who had paced the floor throughout Willow's labor, took his son in trembling hands and looked down into a tiny face that already showed signs of his own strong features. "He's perfect," he whispered, placing the swaddled infant in Willow's arms. "Of course he is," she replied, exhausted but radiant. "He's ours." James was joined 2 years later by a sister, Catherine Elizabeth, and then in 1886 by another boy, Robert William. The children grew strong in the clear desert air, equally at home in the bustle of the inn where their mother's business thrived, and in the open spaces of the ranch where their father's horses ran free. The Juniper Inn expanded twice over the years to accommodate Tropic's growth, adding a separate dining establishment that became known throughout the region for its excellent cuisine. Willow's articles on women's rights were eventually collected and published as a book, bringing her modest fame beyond Utah's borders. Xander's breeding program gained national recognition when one of his horses won an important race in California, ridden by a jockey he had trained himself. Yet for all their public accomplishments, it was their private life that brought them deepest satisfaction. Each evening, no matter what duties had claimed their daylight hours, they would sit together on the porch of their ranch home, now expanded to comfortably house their growing family, and watch the sun set over the western mountains. Did you ever imagine this? Willow asked one such evening, her head resting against Xander's shoulder as they observed their 3 children playing an elaborate game of their own invention in the yard. 20 years had passed since their first meeting, adding silver threads to her auburn hair and deepening the lines around his eyes, but the essential bond between them remained unchanged. "Not in my wildest dreams," Xander admitted, his arm tightening around her waist. "I thought I'd live and die alone out here with only horses for company. And I thought I'd spend my life trying to recover from scandal, forever defined by one man's cruel lies," Willow mused. Instead, you became the most respected woman in 3 counties, a published author and mother to 3 remarkable children," he finished for her. "While you transformed from the mysterious recluse into a community leader who's been asked to run for mayor next term," she countered with a smile. Xander shook his head, still uncomfortable with the recent petition that had circulated in town. "I haven't agreed to that yet, but you will," Willow predicted confidently, "because you care about this place and its future just as I do." He didn't deny it, knowing she understood his motivations better than anyone. Instead, he changed the subject slightly. "Do you ever regret it, coming west, starting over in such a small place?" Willow considered the question seriously, as she did all questions from this man who had become the center of her world. "Not for a moment," she said finally. "Everything that mattered, my writing, my independence, my capacity to effect change, flourished here, not despite the setting but because of it. And I found you, which alone would justify any hardship. Even the fall that left you bleeding by that juniper tree." "Especially that," she assured him, turning to press a kiss to his weathered cheek. "It was the luckiest fall of my life," Xander smiled, the expression coming easily now after years of happiness. "And the luckiest day of mine finding you there." He looked toward their children, now being called in to dinner by Catherine, who at 18 had inherited her mother's organizational abilities along with her father's quiet strength. Though every day since has given that one strong competition. This was the harvest of seeds planted long ago in a moment of pain and fear beneath a juniper tree, in the gentle ministrations of a man who asked no questions, in the courage to begin again far from everything familiar. A bountiful harvest indeed, Willow reflected, and one that continued to yield new gifts with each passing season. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the room that had been theirs for 2 decades, Xander pulled her into his arms, his expression suddenly serious. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Willow asked, resting her hands against his chest. "For bleeding," he replied with a small smile. "For falling, for letting me find you, for everything that followed." "You're welcome," she whispered, understanding completely. "And thank you for cleaning my wounds, for never asking questions, and for giving me time to find my own answers." Their lips met in a kiss that held all the tenderness of new love and all the depth of long companionship, a perfect balance that had sustained them through joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. All the days of their shared life in this unlikely place they both called home. And as they had each night for 20 years, they fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought a wounded woman and a solitary cowboy together beneath a juniper tree in the wild landscape of southern Utah. A meeting that had changed everything and healed wounds far deeper than those visible to the eye.